The Battle of Buna was part of the New Guinea campaign in the Pacific Theatre during World War II. It followed the conclusion of the Kokoda Track campaign and lasted from the 16th of November 1942 until the 22nd of January 1943. The battle was conducted by Australian and United States forces against the Japanese beachheads at Buna, Sanananda and Gona. For these, the Japanese had launched an overland attack on Port Moresby. In light of developments in the Solomon Islands campaign, Japanese forces approaching Port Moresby were ordered to withdraw to and secure these bases on the northern coast. Australian forces maintained contact as the Japanese conducted a well-ordered rearguard action. The Allied objective was to eject their Japanese forces from these positions and deny them the further use. The Japanese forces were skillful, well-prepared and resolute in the defense. They had developed a strong network of well-concealed defenses. Operations in Papua and New Guinea were severely impacted by terrain, vegetation, climate, disease and the lack of infrastructure. In turn, these imposed significant logistical limitations. During the Kokoda Track campaign, these factors applied more or less equally to both belligerents but favored the defender in attacks against well-fortified positions. The battlefield and logistical constraints limited the applicability of conventional Allied doctrine of maneuver and firepower. During the opening stages of the offensive, the Allies faced a severe shortage of food and ammunition. This problem was never entirely resolved. The battle also exposed critical problems with the suitability and performance of Allied equipment. The combat effectiveness of U.S. forces, particularly the U.S. 32nd Division, has been severely criticized. These factors were compounded by repeated demands from General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific area, for a rapid conclusion to the battle. The demands were more to politically secure and strengthen the position of MacArthur's command than for any strategic need. In consequence, troops were hastily committed to battle on repeated occasions, increasing Allied losses and ultimately lengthening the duration of the battle. Allied air power interrupted the Japanese capacity to reinforce and resupply the beachheads from Rabaul. This ultimately made the Japanese position untenable. There was widespread evidence of Japanese cannibalism. In the closing stages of the battle, significant numbers of the defenders were withdrawn by sea or escaped overland toward the west and the Japanese base around Salamaua and Lae. The remaining garrison fought to the death, almost to the man. The battle is noteworthy for a number of reasons. The resolve and tenacity of the Japanese in defense was unprecedented and had not previously been encountered. It was to mark the desperate nature of fighting that characterized battles for the remainder of the Pacific War. For the Allies, there were a number of valuable but costly lessons in the conduct of jungle warfare. Allied losses in the battle were at a rate higher than that experienced at Guadalcanal. Background: Japan's entry into World War II and the war in the Pacific commenced with the attack on Pearl Harbor on 7 December 1941, which was coordinated with closely coinciding attacks on Thailand, the Philippines, the American bases on Guam and Wake Island, and the British possessions of Malaya, Singapore, and Hong Kong. Japanese forces rapidly secured territory in Southeast Asia, the East Indies, and the Central and Southwest Pacific. Australia had been shocked by the speedy collapse of British Malaya and the fall of Singapore. With the fall, nearly 15,000 Australian soldiers became prisoners of war along with the rest of the garrison of some 85,000. U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt ordered General Douglas MacArthur in the Philippines to formulate a Pacific Defense Plan with Australia in March 1942. The Australian Prime Minister, John Curtin, agreed to place Australian forces under the command of MacArthur, who became Supreme Commander, Southwest Pacific Area. MacArthur moved his headquarters to Melbourne in March 1942. The Japanese assaulted Rabaul on the 23rd of January 1942. Rabaul became the forward base for the Japanese campaigns in mainland New Guinea. Japanese forces first landed on the mainland of New Guinea on 8 March 1942 when they invaded Lae and Salamaua to secure bases for the defense of the important base they were developing at Rabaul. The Japanese 17th Army under Lieutenant General Hirokichi Hyakutake was a course-sized command involved in the New Guinea-Guadalcanal and Solomon Islands campaigns. The Japanese 8th Area Army, under General Hitoshi Imamura, was mobilized to take overall command in the areas from the 16th of November 1942. It was responsible for both the New Guinea and Solomon Islands campaigns. Imamura was based at Rabaul. The Japanese 18th Army, under Lieutenant General Hatazo Adachi, was also formed to take over responsibilities for Japanese operations on mainland New Guinea, leaving the 17th Army responsible for the Solomon Islands. Despite Australian fears, the Japanese never intended to invade the Australian mainland. While an invasion was considered by the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters in February 1942, it was judged to be beyond the Japanese military's capabilities and no planning or other preparations were undertaken. Instead, in March 1942 the Japanese military adopted a strategy of isolating Australia from the United States, planning to capture Port Moresby in the territory of Papua and the Solomon Islands, Fiji, Samoa and New Caledonia. The first part of this plan, codenamed Operation Mo, was an amphibious landing to capture Port Moresby, capital of the Australian territory of Papua. This was frustrated by the Japanese defeat in the Battle of the Coral Sea and postponed indefinitely after the Battle of Midway. The Japanese then planned an overland attack to capture the town by advancing from the north coast. Having already captured much of the territory of New Guinea earlier that year, they landed on the 21st of July 1942 to established beachheads at Buna, Gona and Sanananda. This marked the beginning of the Kokoda Track campaign. The South Seas Detachment, under command of Major General Tomataro Hori, advanced using the Kokoda Track to cross the rugged Owen Stanley Range. As the Kokoda Track campaign was taking place, a Japanese invasion force made up of Japanese Special Naval Landing Force units attempted to capture the strategic Milne Bay area in August 1942. The Battle of Milne Bay, fought from the 25th of August to the 7th of September 1942, resulted in a Japanese defeat. This was the first notable Japanese land defeat and raised Allied morale across the Pacific theater. Allied forces identified a Japanese airfield under construction at Guadalcanal, and 19,000 U.S. Marines were embarked to capture the airfield. An amphibious landing was made on the 7th of August. The battle lasted until the 9th of February 1943 and was strongly contested, on land, at sea and in the air. By the 16th of September, Hori's force had advanced as far as Iribiwa, 32 kilometers from Port Moresby, and was close enough to see the town's lights. In light of reverses at Guadalcanal, Lieutenant General Hirokichi Hyakutake determined he could not support both battles battles and, on the 23rd of September, ordered It to withdraw his troops on the Kokoda Track until the Guadalcanal was decided. Limited provision had been made for the resupply of Hori's force and, by this time, the situation had reached a crisis. There were also concerns that Allied forces might land at Buna at any time. On the 26th of September, the Japanese commenced to withdraw from the front line. They fought a well-ordered rearguard action back over the Owen Stanley Range, with the Australian 7th Division in close pursuit. The US 32nd Infantry Division had been sent to New Guinea in September and was ordered to make a circling move against the Japanese eastern flank, near Wairopi. This move commenced on the 14th of October. These plans were rendered ineffectual by the rate of the Japanese withdrawal, but it did leave the division well positioned to coordinate its advance on the beachheads with the Australians that were approaching from the southwest. Major General Arthur Allen was controversially relieved of command of the 7th Division on the 28th of October and replaced by Major General George Vasey, previously commander of the 6th Division. Hori's force had been severely depleted by lack of supply, but at Oivi it received both resupply and reinforcement. The Japanese suffered heavily in the battle around Oivi-Garari from 4 to the 11th of November, and the well-ordered withdrawal that had been planned quickly disintegrated into a rout. The 7th Division was now about 65 kilometers from Buna, Ghana. Although experience demanded caution, the way before them was clear of Japanese forces. Geography, climate and terrain. The Japanese beachheads from which the Kokoda campaign was launched were located about 3 key positions along a 25-kilometer stretch of the north coast of New Guinea, Ghana to the west, Buna to the east, and Sanananda in the center. Roughly 160 kilometers northeast of Port Moresby, it approximates to the most direct line from the to the north coast. The settlements are located on a thin coastal strip that separates the sea from a tidal forest swamp of mangroves, Nipper and Sago, rivers flowing across the broad, flat, coastal plain from the Owen Stanley Range disappear into the swamps and discharge to the sea through many coastal creeks. The coastal strip is rarely more than a few hundred meters at its widest, to little more than a footpad separating the swamp from the sea. The few paths through the swamp were seldom more than 12 foot wide. The area was low-lying and featureless. Buna airstrip is 5 feet above sea level. The elevation is only double this at Soputa, 7.5 miles inland and 85 meters at Popondetta, 21 kilometers inland. The water table is reportedly shallow at about 3 feet. This impacted upon the construction of weapons pits and defensive positions. Areas not waterlogged were either dense jungle or swathes of kunai grass. Coconut plantations filled the wider areas of dry ground along the coastal strip, but neglected undergrowth had reclaimed the ground. The dense kunai grass could grow to 2 meters and the leaves were broad and sharp. Temperatures over the period of the battle ranged from an average daily low of 72 degrees Fahrenheit to 89 degrees Fahrenheit, but with a humidity of 82%. This could be oppressive. In the humid conditions, kunai grass trapped the heat and it was not uncommon for temperatures to reach 50 degrees Celsius. The battle was conducted during the tropical wet season. Average rainfall for December was 368 millimeters, although this figure does not lend itself to a full appreciation of the impact of rain. It was characterized by heavy tropical storms, usually in the afternoon. While the worst of the monsoon held off until after the battle, rain was nonetheless a prevalent feature of the battle. Lieutenant General Robert L. Eichelberger wrote at Buna that year it rained about 170 inches. I have found out since that we got more than our share in December and January. 1942-43 daily rainfall totals of 200 to 250 millimeters were not uncommon. Under these conditions, the few tracks, seldom more than foot trails, quickly became boggy. Disease. The area was one of the most malarial regions in the world. While malaria was the greatest disease threat, other tropical diseases such as dengue fever, scrub typhus, tropical ulcers, dysentery from a range of causes and fungal infections were also common. The impact and susceptibility to disease was exacerbated by poor and insufficient diet. While the Australian Army had encountered malaria in the Middle East, few doctors with the militia had seen the disease before. Supplies of quinine, which was still the major drug in use, were unreliable. Atibrin only became the official suppressive drug used by the Australian forces in late December 1942, and the change to its use was not immediate. The need for a strict anti-malaria program was not fully understood. Many officers saw this as a medical rather than a disciplinary issue, and did not compel the men to take the medicine. It was common for Australian soldiers to wear shorts and rolled sleeves in response to the oppressive heat. Mosquito nets and repellent were in short supply, while the repellent that was supplied was considered ineffective. Burgerud states that 85 to 95% of all Allied soldiers in the area carried malaria during the course of the battle. There were 4.8 men hospitalized through sickness for every one Allied battle casualty. 75% of the cases were attributed to malaria. After he had relieved Harding, Eichelberger gave orders to take the temperature of an entire company near the front. Every member of the company was running a fever. By necessity, many men remained in the front lines with a fever as high as 40 degrees Celsius. Bryan reports, Japanese accounts of the prevalence of disease are similarly shocking. Logistics. After the Battle of Milne Bay, the Allies set about developing a number of aircraft landing fields. The fields were built to enable Allied forces to more quickly deploy in response to any future Japanese landings, as forward bases for the air campaign against the Japanese, and to support the battle at the beachheads. They were used to deploy a part of the U.S. 32nd Division to the Buna area. Colonel Leif Sverdrup was awarded the Silver Star and a Distinguished Service Medal for his efforts in reconnaissance and construction of air strips in New Guinea, including those at Fasari, Mbessa and Pongani. During the Kokoda campaign, there were three alternatives available to the Australians for resupply. Supplies and equipment could either be carried by Papuan porters overland from Port Moresby, they could be airdropped, or they could be landed at a forward airstrip and man-packed from there. Topography precluded the prospect of developing an overland route for motor transport. Supply was limited by the number of available aircraft and unsuitable weather over the Owen Stanley Range, stopping flights. Civilian aircraft and pilots were pressed into service in an effort to meet demand. They were mainly used in flights between Australia and New Guinea or in rear areas in order to release military planes and personnel for service in forward areas. Unreliable maps or poor visibility in the drop zone meant that supplies were often misdropped. Parachutes were in limited supply. As a result, only essential equipment, ammunition and medical supplies were dropped with parachutes. Rations and other supplies were free-dropped. Packaging was primitive and inadequate. The rate of recovery was low and the rate of breakage high, on average 50%. Of a drop made on the 22nd of November, it was reported that only about 5% was recovered. While the use of air transport generally restricted the availability of heavy equipment, some artillery was broken down and transported by air to the Buna area. Another notable exception was equipment of the 43rd General Service Regiment. On the 25th of November, 210 men of the regiment were flown to Dobodura to construct more runways. Transported with them were 2 tractors, 5 mowers, a sheep's foot roller and a grader. All of these were disassembled and cut down to allow loading and then reconstructed on site. Airstrips were quickly developed at Dobodura and Popondetta to support the US 32nd Division and Australian 7th Division respectively. The first temporary strip at Dobodura was cleared by a company of the 114th Engineer Battalion. It was completed on the 21st of November, after a day of work. The strip at Popondetta was commenced on the 19th of November by the 2/6th Field Company. Completed after 2 days, it received its first landings on the 21st of November. The alternative of resupply by sea was equally problematic. Before the war, coastal traders approached the north coast of New Guinea from Rabaul, on the island of New Britain. This route was denied by the Japanese occupation of the island. The coastal passage from Milne Bay was treacherous and lacked an identified safe sea route. An assortment of small vessels were operated by the small ships section of the U.S. Army Services of Supply. The vessels were schooners, motor ships, motor launches, cabin cruisers, ketchers, trawlers, barges, and miscellaneous vessels, most of which were ancient and rusty. Quote, "They were leased or requisitioned by the U.S. Army and largely crewed by Australians under contract with USASOS. Initially, these vessels faced a constant threat of attack by Japanese planes. This situation eased as the Allies began to achieve their dominance near the end of 1942. The small ships section was operating vessels up to 500 tons, but most were significantly smaller than this. Oro Bay was the nearest suitable location to be developed as a harbor in support of the Buna operations. It is located 16 kilometers southeast of Dobodura. The road eventually constructed to connect the two was 40 kilometers long. Without any developed facilities, stores and equipment had to be cross-loaded onto barges or double canoes for landing. Harding's plan was to support his forces by ferrying supplies from Oro Bay to Hariko using luggers and a captured Japanese barge. Late on the 16th of November, making this journey, a convoy of 3 luggers with the barge, small boats and pontoons in tow was attacked by 14 Japanese Zero fighters as it rounded Cape Sudus. The 3 boats and the barge were set ablaze. 2 25-pounders of the 5th Field Regiment loaded on the barge were lost. 24 soldiers and 28 Papuans were killed. Many more were wounded. 2 more luggers were attacked the next morning. 1 was lost, while 1 had to return to Milne Bay for repairs. Only 1 lugger remained and was insufficient to support Harding's force. Sea resupply from Oro Bay was effectively suspended for 3 weeks while these losses were made good. Limited supplies could be paddled or manhandled around the coast, or packed overland. Apart from the critical shortages this created on the eve of battle, Harding's force had to rely on air support for resupply in the interim. The Allies had jeeps flown in to help move stores forward. These significantly eased the workload faced by the Papuan porters. The transverse track connecting Angad, Soputa and Jumbura was developed with corduroy to allow communication between the 3 Allied fronts. The Allies faced critical shortages of ammunition and rations at the start of the battle. American troops subsisted for almost a week on a daily diet of 1/3 of a C ration and 1/6 of a D ration. This was equivalent to about 1,000 calories a day. The lot of the Australian troops was similar. The logistical situation improved as the battle progressed but remained a defining feature of the engagement. Improvements in infrastructure and capacity were largely consumed by increases in the size of the force. The Japanese fighting along the Kokoda Track faced the same logistical problems as the Australians but lacked the benefit of aerial resupply to any significant extent. Stocks of rice and other foodstuffs identified at Gona when it was captured on the 8th of December suggest that the garrison had been well provisioned at the start of the battle. The Japanese positions had been supplied by sea from Rabaul. Attempts at the start of the battle to land troops and supplies from destroyers were only partly successful. Allied air power at both Rabaul and over the beachheads curtailed the use of surface ships for resupply. Some troops and equipment destined for Buna were landed near the mouth of the Mambere River. Reinforcement and supplies were barged from there to the beachheads. Some supplies were landed from submarines, although size and travel time dictated that the quantities weren't necessarily small. On the night of the 25th of December, a Japanese submarine unloaded supplies and ammunition at Buna Government Station, the last time the Japanese received supplies. There was limited use of aerial resupply by the Japanese at Buna. The normal rice ration was 28 ounces. Rice formed the bulk of the Japanese ration. At the end of December, each man received around 360 milliliters of rice per day, but this was reduced to 40 to 80 milliliters in early January. There was no food for the period 8 to 12 January. By the time that the battle was over on the 22nd of January, the garrison had been virtually starved into submission. There was widespread evidence that the Japanese had resorted to cannibalizing the dead to stay alive. Sea route opened in October. The Allies captured Goodenough Island off the northeast coast of New Guinea with little Japanese resistance. In the hands of the Japanese, the island had potentially compromised the security of the north coast. From early 1943, the Allies developed it as a forward base. The route between the North Shore and the D'Entrecasteaux Islands had never been accurately charted. It was described by Colonel Wilson, Chief of Transportation, as the most dangerous coastline in the world. Vessels of the small ships section, apart from delivering cargo from Milne Bay to Wainagela, Pongani, Oro Bay and Hariko, made a valuable contribution to opening up the inside passage to larger shipping. Of the section, Masterson Road, the Australian crews rigged sails when the engines broke down, and made emergency repairs when the hulls were punctured with bullets or jagged coral. Quote, They landed elements of the invasion force and provided logistical support. To avoid Japanese attacks, they hid in rivers by day and moved at night through uncharted waters, marking reefs with empty oil drums and keeping records of observations and soundings, which were later used in charts. Those efforts were augmented by the arrival of HMAS Paluma. The 45-ton examination vessel began surveys to find a reliable approach for larger vessels from Milne Bay to Oro Bay. In addition to surveys, the vessel was to install lights, land shore parties for reconnaissance, establish radio stations and pilot ships through discover channels. By early November, Paluma had found a route around Cape Nelson suitable for larger vessels in the small ships fleet. Thereafter, the larger vessels discharged at Porlock. The luggers concentrated on transporting forward from there. The hydrographic section in the Royal Australian Navy learned of the local effort and provided additional support. HMA ships Beauregard, Stella, and Polaris were tasked to survey and establish safe passage for large ships from Milne Bay to Cape Nelson. HMAS Paluma worked on the route forward to Oro Bay. These combined efforts made the large ship convoy service of Operation Lilliput a possibility. The first large vessel to deliver supplies to Oro Bay was the SS Karsik. She was escorted by HMAS Lithgow. In Operation Karsik on the night of 11/12 December 1942, the cargo was 4 Stuart light tanks of the Australian 2, 6th Armoured Regiment and 7 days' supply for the 2, 9th Battalion. Karsik returned with a second load of tanks on the 14th, in Operation Tramsik. On the 18th of December the Japara, escorted by Lithgow, departed Milne Bay and arrived at Oro Bay on the 20th. This voyage inaugurated the regular supply runs of Operation Lilliput. With few exceptions, the convoys of Lilliput were composed of the Dutch KPM vessels under the control of the U.S. Army Services of Supply, escorted by an Australian corvette.